Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Gost emisije Recite Al Jazeeri je Bernard Hudson, osnivač firme Advanced Archer Technologies i bivši šef antiterorističkog odjela Američke centralno obavještene agencije. Bernard, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, I want to start by asking you a couple of questions when it comes to the use of drones in Ukraine, and later we'll move to the Middle East. But regarding Ukraine, why has the war in Ukraine become a hotbed for the use of drones? And was it the inability of either side to break through the other's integrated air defenses that has forced them to increase the agility of their fielded forces and rely more heavily on standoff weapons, including long-range artillery, missiles, and drones?
Haroon, I think you're mostly correct on pointing out that for one of the reasons that we've seen such an incredible increase in the use of small drones in war in Ukraine is that you've now got stabilized front lines. You've essentially got a war of attrition going on where the front lines only move a few meters a day most of the time. And that's been an incredible opportunity, militarily speaking, for artillery, some use of missiles, and an incredible use of drones to take the fight to the enemy. So if you think about it, if you're a soldier trapped in a trench somewhere in Ukraine, whether it's on the Russian side or the Ukrainian side, you're going to want to minimize your exposure to the enemy and make it hard for the enemy to move. Artillery can do that. Artillery combined with drones, spotting for the artillery, finding targets for it, has proven very effective. The other reason I think that you've seen such an increase in drones in Ukraine is that even before the war, Ukraine had a very capable manufacturing, military industries, and physics. When the war started, all of that human capital, all of that talent that had been focused on other parts of aerospace were redirected into the war effort. And I would say at this point, I believe the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians have a slight edge on this, are the most proficient users of small drones anywhere on the planet.
We have seen quite a different number of drones being used in the Ukrainian battlefield. The most common is, of course, the Chinese-designed civilian quadcopter, which is available on Amazon and Alibaba. Then we have also seen the use of the FPV, the first-person view drone, most commonly used in the form of a kamikaze drone. And the third is, of course, the infamous Shahed 136. I was wondering if you could explain to our viewers, give us some background on each and every type of these drones used in Ukraine.
Sure. The best way to think about them is there's three different categories here, as you just pointed out. The first category, you'd call it Group 1, can sit in a person's hand, is usually less than 9 kilograms in weight, or can carry up to 9 kilograms of weight, can stay in the air maybe 20, 30 minutes, up to an hour sometimes, and go maybe about 12 kilometers. You'd see this being given to common soldiers on the front lines to attack other people's targets. Some of these cross over into what you would call the FPV drones, which are the kamikaze drones. You see a lot of those videos on the internet of those chasing down and hitting tanks, vehicles, and people. The second group, what's commonly called Group 2, is up to about 20 kilograms in weight, 25 kilograms, probably the top, can stay in the air for a few hours, can go maybe up to 100 kilometers. Those are often used for surveillance. Some of those can actually also be fitted with explosives. And then the final category, what we call Group 3, including the Shahed 136. Those are about the size of a Volkswagen. Some of those can go up to 2,500 kilometers, which is across most of Europe if it was a one-way trip.
Right.
The Shahed 136 is mostly used to attack infrastructure targets, i.e. important public buildings in Ukraine. So you think about power plants, office buildings, military bases. It's had a mixed reputation on the battlefront. In the beginning, it was more effective than it is now. At this point, it is not commonly used against soldiers in the field, but again, against infrastructure targets. If you're trying to turn the lights off in Kyiv, this is one of the type of weapon systems that you would use to do that.
But I mean, in terms of its technology, how would you assess the Shahed 136? Are we talking about a very basic, very rudimentary type of drone?
So the terrifying thing about drones is that, if you think about it, 10, 15 years ago, these things were secret and there weren't very many of them. Today, they're very commonplace. Everyone's got them and they're very cheap. So, the Iranians have been developing the Shahed 136 for their own purposes. It's a perfectly decent drone, but it's not nuclear science. Almost any country with any type of industrial base, even a very small industrial base, can produce something like this. And indeed, what you see as an output from the war in Ukraine is lots of other countries producing things that look an awful lot like the Shahed 136. So they may have gotten there first in the public eye, but it is an increasingly common type of drone that almost any military in the world can now produce if they want to produce it.
Right. As for Russia's drone technology, Moscow has deployed indigenous models such as the Orient, the Eleron 3, Orlan 10, and the Lancet, but they have not really gained much popularity, so to speak, compared to other drones, like for example the Turkish Bayraktar TB3. Why is that? So why hasn't Russia really been able to make huge leaps in this field, even before sanctions were slapped?
Sure. So I think it's worthwhile to keep a couple of things in the forefront of our minds. One of the things that has come out of this war is knowledge, or essentially the learning lessons or lessons learned, is that the larger drones, the Bayraktar 2 that you just mentioned, the US Predators, Reapers, the very big aircraft that are essentially proper sized aircraft, those can barely survive hours on a modern battlefield. They're simply too big, too easy to spot, too easily shot down. Turkey's Bayraktar 2s, while they played a role in the beginning of the war, were very quickly shot down by the Russian military. And they are no longer deployed in a militarily meaningful way. To your question on where Russia's drone industry is, I think it's hard to assess because the Russians don't put as much of the data out on the internet as the Ukrainians do. So if you take a look at, we know a lot more about Ukraine's military use of drones because they produce an awful lot of video and evidence you can all take a look at. The Russians don't do as much as that. However, I would say that the Russians have gone a very long way in 2.5 years to catch up with the Ukrainians, and are certainly, actually, I would say at this point, the Russians have a better small drone program than the Americans do. The other thing to keep in mind with the Russians is that just last year, they removed their former defense minister and replaced him with someone who's a manufacturing expert. One of that manufacturing expert's priorities has been figuring out a way to mass produce small amounts of drones that can be put on the front lines and given to average Russian soldiers. And there's evidence that that's actually happening.
Yeah, there was this really interesting report that I read recently, written by a team of cross-border journalists from a number of European Union countries. And they discovered that, quite a number of components coming from various European tech companies is still making its way towards Russia, despite all these sanctions. A lot of these components coming from German manufacturers. How is this really possible? I mean, what channels are being used? How does Russia acquire these high-tech parts for its drone program and for its entire military-industrial complex?
I think it's a great question that gets to the heart of one of the major problems with the European and American response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine, which is, in the end, just how leaky and hard to enforce technology sanctions are. So the technology that goes into most of these small drones also is used in a number, for the most part, is used in a lot of other type of technologies. That technology is sold by the US and the Europeans to countries all over the world. Nothing stops a company in that other second country from then reselling it to the Russians, or even some cases being a Russian front company, but more commonly, a company buys this stuff, sells it to somebody, that somebody may sell it to a third party, that party then sells it to Russia. So it's very hard to enforce these type of sanctions, especially with products that are so common as the one that goes into drones. And the last piece that's important to remember on this is even if those sanctions were to work, Russia's relationship with China certainly gives it access to all the technology it would need to build completely militarily capable small drones at scale. So even if these sanctions were better and less leaky, Russia would still be able to produce indigenously and with Chinese equipment almost as many drones as they need.
Mm-hmm. Now, to date, most public discussions on drones have dealt with aerial drones, but what can you tell us about naval and land-based drone systems, and also which countries are in a position to benefit the most from the revolution in drone technology?
So to answer the second question first, the countries that are in the most best position to benefit from the revolution in drone affairs are small and medium-sized countries that couldn't in the past afford much of an air force or much of a navy. The fact that you can now build cheaply drones that can fly and increasingly drones on the water that don't require crews, airfields, naval bases, that allows even small countries to have very capable military forces that they can put on the surface of the ocean or in the air. And especially if you think about it in the sense of navies, there's only 5 or 6 navies that can sort of, project power anywhere over the world. Within the next 20 years, even small countries will be able to send militarily capable drones with no pilots or crew onto the ocean, keep them there for months at a time, sail them around the globe if they want to. That day is coming, and air power and naval power will no longer be the monopoly of the rich few countries. And that's going to be an incredible challenge for countries like mine, the United States, Great Britain, frankly, even China, as they contend with a world in which many other countries now can threaten their forces on the sea or in the air.
Right. I mean, we have seen, Ukraine, a country which didn't basically have a navy, completely obliterate at least half of Russia's Black Sea fleet, which was stationed in Sevastopol, using sea drones. That's one example. The second thing I wanted to ask you is, will this massive use and development of sea drones make it, make the use of aircraft carriers, obsolete? Would there still be a need for such huge investments?
It's a great question. At the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy had a lot of battleships that were very expensive and that they didn't need anymore, and they went to aircraft carriers. If you have the ability to have planes without pilots, then you really don't need massive aircraft carriers to have air power. And so you could take a cargo ship loaded up with drones and essentially have a poor man's aircraft carrier that would be quite capable. So, longer term, as we think about the impact, yes, the U.S. will not be able to dominate naval air power with the 12 or so aircraft carriers it has. It's going to have to share that space with other countries. Just to point out, you mentioned the Ukraine example. Mm-hmm. So the Ukrainian maritime naval drone program probably cost them less than $10 to $15 million, and they sank almost $1 billion mm-hmm. of Russian naval assets for less than $15 million US dollars. That's an incredible military disparity in what you can do with this small emerging technology. It's incredibly disruptive.
When I watched the recent, U.S. and British efforts to rein in on Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping lanes, it didn't really make much sense to me to send very expensive aircraft carriers and destroyers, to fight the Houthis who use very cheap drones and missiles to attack these international shipping lanes. This will, in the long run, definitely dent the U.S. DoD's budget and their overall spending. It doesn't really make sense to invest so much. It's hugely disproportionate to use such expensive military gear to fight against very cheap unmanned drones and very cheap Iranian-made missiles.
It's an excellent point. The case in Yemen, where you have a tribal militia that doesn't even completely rule the country, been able to fight the world's greatest navy, most militarily capable navy, the US Navy, and some of its allies. It's been able to fight it to a stalemate at one of the most important commercial choke points in the world, using a combination of some sea drones, missiles, and naval and air drones. Every other country in the world, their military analysts are looking at the lessons being learned off the coast of Yemen and are furiously reworking their battle plans to say, you know what, while drones have a place on the land for sure, Ukraine shows us that, there is certainly a case for use of drones over water or on the water. And if even a power like the United States is confounded by this, that's well worth our investment.
We've also seen just last week, non-state actors such as Hezbollah, make strides in the use of drones. And I was wondering, how did they manage to evade Israeli radars and strike towns and cities deep inside Israel proper without being, without being seen on radar?
It's a great question. It gets to the heart of how air defense was organized in the last 40 or 50 years. Air defense was designed to stop two types of things: missiles, especially ballistic missiles that might threaten your country, or aircraft with human beings inside it, and very limited numbers of aircraft.
Right.
So if you think about the defense systems that are out there, they're looking for things that are the size of a major fighter jet or a missile. Drones, in many cases, have the radar signature of a bird. Right. And in some cases, even if you see the drone coming, you won't see one, you're going to see 50 or 100. So if you take a look, for example, at some of these drone light shows that they do in China, they'll put up 5,000 drones at a time and keep them in the air for an hour. You can turn that into a military weapon. And if you sent 100 drones at even the most premier air defense system in the world, those systems are not designed to shoot down 100 moving objects that quickly, and some of them will get through. So in the case of the Israelis, as much as they've invested in their air defense, the fact is that these things are cheap, small, fast, fly low, and can be used by barely trained personnel. It's very hard to defend against that, especially if someone is willing to send large numbers of them at you.
Right. There have been many, ethical and legal and moral questions regarding the use of drones. I mean, how people perceive the legitimacy of drone strikes, firing missiles from remotely piloted aircraft at militants is always central to whether and how the government can continue to use them. Are drone strikes, in your view, legitimate? Are they sound on moral and legal basis?
So I think most of the world's militaries have already taken that vote and said, yes, they are. I think the argument that the world's militaries would say is drones are very precise at their targeting. They will hit within a meter or two, usually, of what you're focused on. That's in comparison to dropping a bomb from a moving jet fighter, which, they're usually much larger weapons. They're not as accurate, and they risk far more civilian casualties. So I think most of the militaries on the world, certainly after the events in Ukraine, would say that it's certainly ethical and, frankly, useful to use drones in combat like this. I do think, you touch on a great point, though, about the ethical issues, and there's two that are currently out there. One is it ethical and legal to give drones the ability to choose their own targets and attack those targets because a computer chip on board the aircraft says so? So, in fact, the United Nations is trying to address this question right now to figure out, do we want to get countries to sign up to put some sort of prohibition or limitations on allowing a flying robot to choose what it wants to target and to kill who it wants to target? I think there are some military thinkers who on very practical grounds don't like this because they're afraid of the risk that it might pose to their own troops. But that's an absolute serious ethical question. I think the other one, Haroon, that people don't ask as much as they probably should, that deals with ethics, is what are the ethics of mass surveillance from the air?
Right.
As drones get cheaper and it gets cheaper to process the video data that they put in these machines, you will have an opportunity within the next 5 or 7 years to see most of the major cities on Earth will start having airborne drone surveillance overhead, and it will be cheap enough to put the entire city, that everything that happens outside in the city, under surveillance and available to the government. That's a civil liberties fight that's actually worth having about, for at least for liberal democracies. Is that a technological development that we want to go forward with without asking some hard questions about?
Are we definitely heading in that direction?
100%. I mean, any military or security planner who looks at the ability of drones, their ability to collect data, is going to have a strong bias towards saying, well, for the public safety, let's put these things up overhead over our major cities. Let's collect the data. We can hold on to the data for as long as we want. You get into questions then, if you're holding on to this sort of, data about the events in a major city, say it's Sarajevo, say it's Belgrade, say it's Rome, and you're holding on to that data for 15, 20, 30 years, well, who's got access to all that data and what lawful purposes can they use it to? You think about what I would call a time machine that's been built in the sky that could go back and look at things that you were doing outside when you were a teenager, when you're in your 50s. That's going to be technically possible to do within a few short years.
Okay. I wanted to ask you a question. You spent a lot of time at the agency, and it was during Obama's first mandate that there was a significant increase in the use of drones, mostly by the agency, in tribal areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and there was quite a number of civilian casualties in these attacks, also in Somalia and Yemen. And I was wondering, based on your statistics and data, have some of these attacks been counterproductive in a way? Have they, led to the creation of more like-minded extremists?
So I would say that for the governments that engage in this sort of, military tactic, their argument would be these are very targeted military strikes. They know to a great degree what they're trying to strike. I think, to the argument that some people will make that you are creating more terrorists than you're removing, I think the argument is pretty clear that if you're going after an organization has a finite number of people and supporters in it. If those supporters are, reduced either through military action, killed, 20, 30, 40% of them, that organization will tend to fall apart and no longer be effective. I think you take a look at the state of Al-Qaeda today, the state of other groups that have been subjected to this sort of attack.
Even ISIL.
ISIS. They are not the same organizations they were. They don't have the same capabilities. It's not to say that attacking rebel movements, terrorist movements from the air completely eliminates all risk, but it certainly reduces the capabilities of those organizations. But it's not a tool that you can only use in isolation, and it's not magic dust that you can throw out and say, once we've struck these number of targets, we no longer have a terrorist threat. You do have to use other tools of government.
And finally, as we move towards the end of our interview, I wanted to ask you, there have been quite a number of calls from international organizations such as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch to try and regulate the use of armed drones, especially those employing AI in selecting targets. I know that coming up with an international convention is really difficult. Getting many countries to sign is even harder. But do you see it as necessary to move towards that direction in the long run?
So I'm very supportive of what the United Nations is trying to do on the autonomous selection of targets and how drones can ethically be used in combat. I think that's a worthwhile effort for a lot of serious countries to be involved in. And I think you can make a military case to global militaries that it's in their interest to look at this as well. To your question, Haroon, I think I would suggest to the people interested in civil liberties and Amnesty International that some of their effort in this domain really should be put towards the question of mass surveillance. That's a threat if you believe that it's a threat that can happen every single day. Drone strikes against a rebel movement that's been targeted by a government is going to be a relatively uncommon occurrence. But if the fact that you are living in Rome or in Paris or in New York and you go outside every day and you understand that the government has drones overhead that are taping every single thing that takes place outside and are going to be doing it for the next 20 or 30 years of your life, I think that's a worthwhile discussion for the international organizations worried about such things.
Right, that's a good point to end this conversation. Bernard Hudson, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
A pleasure.
Always trust.
I ask.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?